Our story begins sometime in the late 17th century, as many of our stories do. This time aboard a French man-of-war, Le Victoire. Its captain has just been killed in an engagement against the English. The battle having been won, the crew announced the election of a new commander, a young French noble, his last name Misson, sometimes spelled Mission. Misson, having witnessed the decadence of the Catholic Church and grown cynical towards government, makes a speech to his men announcing they bid defiance to the power of Europe, enjoy everything he wished, reign sovereign of the southern seas, and lawfully make war on all the world. The crew cheer for him. Vive le Capitaine Misson! His close lieutenant, a blasphemous priest named Caraccioli, kneels before his captain and presents him their banner, a black field, but Misson rejects it, saying they are not mere pirates. Instead, he chooses a white ensign, with liberty painted in the fly, and the motto Deo a Libertate, for God and liberty. The crew agree to hold elections on all matters, and to split their fortunes equally. They embark on a piratical crusade across the Americas, and when they encounter a slave ship, the enslaved are liberated from their shackles. Misson stated that though these men were distinguished from the Europeans by their color, customs, or religious rites, they were the same work of the same omnipotent being, and endued with equal reason. Wherefore, he decided they might be treated like free men. He would go so far as to banish the name of slavery from among them. Neither does he allow swearing nor drunkenness, viewing it as a sin against God. Desiring a dominion for themselves, the crew sail across the Atlantic, around Africa. They landed on the island of Hanna, allying themselves with the natives and taking wives from among them. After engaging in epic battles with the Johannians' enemies and plundering many prizes, settled on the coast of Madagascar, constructing themselves a settlement and dubbing it Libertalia. Henceforth, whether born French, English, Dutch, or African, they would all be known as Liberii. It is a fantastical story, but that's all it is. A story. It has no basis in reality. Libertalia is a literary invention by Captain Charles Johnson, the pen name of the mysterious author who wrote A General History of the Pirates in 1724. The book is a strange mixture of fact and fiction. Nowadays we'd call it a historical fiction, but it was written very close to the actual events. And because pirate history is poorly documented, many historians have erroneously used Johnson's book as a basis for the research, instead of a mere source of trivia or inspiration, since it has been viewed uncritically for so long. Marxist historian Marcus Rediker used the story of Libertalia to present a narrative of pirates being an early form of social revolutionaries, a position heavily criticized by other pirate historians. Of course, Rediker has made a lot of valuable contributions to pirate and maritime history, such as compiling data on types of ships stolen, or the average rate of literacy among seamen. But no serious researcher well read in this period, both from different modern authors and contemporary sources, would consider his ideas anything but silly. There is nothing wrong with presenting an unorthodox analysis of history. It's a great way to provoke debate, come up with new ideas, and discover new things. But it does become a problem when this analysis becomes accepted as a basic fact, instead of just a proposed theory. Rediker's works have served to inspire popular media like Pirates of the Caribbean 3, At World's End, Black Sails, Black Flag, and even though these are works of fiction, and even fantasy, a lot of people take inspiration and even learn history through these mediums, all of which do include valuable and authentic history in them. But the bit about pirates being social revolutionaries has become a tired trope. If you desire a modern parallel, pirates are best compared to paramilitary groups and biker gangs. I think it's interesting that retellings of the Libertalia and Misson story tend to exempt the religious sentiment. These ideas of religious anarchy were nothing new, and quite prevalent during the previous century especially, with movements like the Ranters, Levelers, and especially Puritans. Many Puritans were against monarchy and slavery, but on religious grounds. It must be understood that religion and ideology would remain inseparable until the French Revolution. Misson wasn't critical so much against religion itself, rather against the Catholic Church. It's a critique of rights, not of faith itself, and it was written by an English Protestant. No story comes out of nowhere, be it from personal experiences or some intertextual relation to a previous work. Johnson's story of Libertalia was inspired by previous texts which were very similar, retellings of the life of the actual pirate Henry Every. You might have seen my recently published episode on him. He was elected captain after a mutiny, sailed to the Indian Ocean, stole a Mughal ship, and vanished with his money. He was viewed as a sort of folk hero in England, and printed stories eventually began to circulate that he had married an Indian princess and built a pirate republic on Madagascar. Every story does contain a grain of truth. Madagascar was in a sense a pirate paradise, but it was also an absolute hellscape of disease, massacre, and slavery. The real history is much more interesting than the legend, and certainly more complicated. It gives us more stuff to talk about. So, let's raise the anchor, unfurl the courses, and set sail for Madagascar. Pirates did not arrive on Madagascar and found it a barren slate to shape how they pleased. Instead, they had to work with what was already there and adapt themselves. Vital to understanding piracy on Madagascar is understanding the native peoples which inhabited it, their history, and the very rocks which made up the island itself. When placed next to the giant of Africa, Madagascar looks comparatively small. In truth, it's one of the world's largest islands, being 2.5 times the size of Great Britain. Geologically, Africa and Madagascar were once part of the supercontinent of Gondwana millions of years ago. However, Madagascar was more closely connected to India, and they eventually split away from Gondwana. India and Madagascar finally separated during the late Cretaceous, some 84 million years ago. Geographically, Madagascar and Africa are quite similar. Madagascar is often called the Great Red Island, owing to its earthen crust primarily consisting of red laterite. The red earthen flesh lies covered with a skin of coarse grass, in places scarred by great lavacas, looking like wounds inflicted by giants. The climate is temperate, with the central highlands housing valleys of rice paddies and subhumid forest. The northern terrain slopes into the mangrove swamps, leaking into the Mozambique Channel. The eastern coast lies well grown with a verdant rainforest, often shrouded in a mist produced by the trade winds, whereas the south, lying in the rain shadow of the highlands, is dominated by semi-desert. Spiny forests, thorny scrubs, and the bombastic baobab tree. It is comparable to southern Africa, but animal life is completely different. Absent are the elephants, giraffes, lions or leopards. Crocodiles and the river pig made their way across, but most of the animal life on Madagascar is unique to it. You're probably familiar with the lemur. Sadly, there are no penguins on Madagascar, yet. The people of Madagascar, known as Malagasy, are almost as unexpected as the fauna. It is one of the last regions of our Earth settled by humans, and the migratory voyage of its first inhabitants is truly remarkable. Hailing from Indonesia, they appear to have used outrigger canoes to sail along the southern coast of Eurasia, crossed over to Arabia and Africa, and finally the Great Red Island of our story. It is not known when exactly. Somewhere between the 4th and 6th centuries appears likely. The first settlers would have encountered now extinct megafauna, like the giant lemur and elephant birds. Most of the indigenous rainforest was destroyed using slash-and-burn agriculture, giving way for the island's modern climate. By the middle of the first millennium, Bantu expansion into southern Africa led many of them to seek refuge in Madagascar. This expansion appears to have been facilitated by the Indonesian introduction of staple crops like yams, breadfruit, and bananas. Modern Malagasys are mostly an admixture of Africans and Asians. Certain tribes lean one way or the other on the racial extremes. Their language is almost entirely Indo-Polynesian in terms of grammar and structure, with 20% of its vocabulary being loanwords from Bantu, Arabic, French, English, and Sanskrit. The pagan faith of the Malagasy stresses the importance of ancestor worship, and the ritual importance of cattle and rice cultivation, two of the products most often sold to pirates. A special importance is given to the cardinal directions, and rectangular houses were often constructed with a door on the western side, and different symbolic significance attached to the various sides and corners. In the wet zones of the island, these houses are typically built on stilts to avoid the moisture. Maritime interaction would continue to play a vital part in the island's history. Some of these far-flung visitors may have settled down. On St. Mary's Island and Voipeno, a small group of Malagasy claimed to be Jews. However, all of the new settlers appear to have been absorbed rather quickly. In the 15th century arrived a large Chinese trading fleet under Cheng Hu, but Arabs were the most prominent. Arab merchants appear to have arrived before the advent of Islam, but recorded visits date to the 10th century, when Islam was introduced and trading posts constructed. They called Madagascar Island of the Moon. Local products like beef, rice, tortoiseshell, beeswax and honey were exchanged for tools, utensils, cloth, glass beads, and porcelain. Slavery was an important part of the network, going both ways. The large-scale import of African slaves for agriculture made a huge contribution to the modern genetic makeup. Certain tribes would convert to Islam, most prominent being the Antaloatra and Antemoro, meaning the people from the ocean. The Antaloatra were cosmopolitan Malagasy of distant Arabic descent. They established a prosperous civilization on the island during the Middle Ages and would control trade with the Arabs. And though they spoke a mix of Swahili and Arabic and maintained some respect for the Mohammedan faith, the 16th century found them a minority and eventually absorbed into neighboring tribes. The Antemoro were conquered in the 17th century. The tenets of Islam have largely gone forgotten. Nowadays they have a taboo on pork. That's about it. The medieval history of the Malagasy is hard to keep track of, since it was never recorded by the natives, only preserved in oral tradition, written down in the 19th century, but often conflicting between the different tribes. Clans within peoples fought, switched sides, traded, merged, and enslaved. Far-flung immigration never really stopped, and new peoples were made, absorbed, or driven extinct. It is a fascinating history, but it largely eludes us. The year 1500 is regarded as a keystone in Madagascar history, as it marked the first arrival of Europeans. Specifically, a stray Portuguese ship commanded by Bartolomeu Dias separated from its fleet by a storm. He decided to name the island São Lourenço, St. Lawrence, even though the name Madagascar appeared as early as 1502 on a Portuguese map. When the Portuguese discovered that the trade on Madagascar was dominated by their Arab competitors, they decided to change gears. Between 1506 and 1507, they destroyed a row of trading settlements on the northwest coast, but the Portuguese abandoned the idea of a Madagascar colony quite quickly, owing to the temperament of the locals and their existing possession of mainland possessions. A few Portuguese were shipwrecked and some missionaries tried to convert the Malagasy, without success. The next Europeans to take interest in the island were the French, specifically from Dieppe. Since they lacked any royal backing, they had no qualms with breaking the law, turning pirate and robbing from Portuguese ships. The first attack occurred as early as 1508. The first Briton to set foot on the Red Island was a Scotsman dubbed Jacques Le Cousin by his French shipmates. When they landed in 1529, they were deceived by the locals, a number of their men killed, and the rest narrowly escaping. They named a nearby point Cape Treachery. After 1547, the French would not visit the island for over half a century. The English did not show much interest, nor did the Dutch. Madagascar was little more than an occasional stopping point en route to the riches of India, China, and the isles in between. The Dutch were especially brutal. In their first documented visit at St. Augustine's Bay, the locals were treated with great brutality. When the English first arrived at the same place in 1599, the Malagasy responded aggressively. Owing to hostile natives and disease, the Dutch had dubbed the island Coemeterium Batavorum, graveyard of the Dutch. On their voyages to the East Indies, they preferred instead to make landfall at the smaller, neighboring island of Mauritius, colonized in 1598. With the advent of the East India Companies, European visits became more frequent, and the Malagasy less hostile as a result. But interactions in the early 17th century could vary immensely, as did reports. Some wrote of the Malagasy as treacherous and hostile. Others called the island the most richest and fruitful in the world, and its people the happiest. Trade was becoming more frequent. Interestingly, the Malagasy had no interest in importing iron, instead favoring silver and Indian beads in return for their sheep and cattle. The English were now developing the idea of a Madagascar colony. Its chief proponent was a merchant named Richard Boothby. He spent several years lobbying for this idea in Parliament, before eventually publishing pamphlets making up fantastical stories about this faraway paradise. His true motive appears to have been revenge. He had a bone to pick with the East India Company, and a Madagascar colony would help him break their monopoly of the Eastern trade. It was around the same time, during the reign of Charles I, that both English and French privateers had begun sailing into the Indies, robbing Mughal pilgrim ships and bringing home extravagant fortunes. A Madagascar colony would not only facilitate trade, but also privateering. The one issue was the company. They believed a Madagascar colony to be a threat to their stranglehold of Indian commerce. Despite several setbacks, an expedition was somehow launched in August of 1644, in the midst of the English Civil War. The voyage went surprisingly well. There was only one casualty. People would usually drop like flies during overseas crossings, and the colonists landed safely in St. Augustine's Bay. Crops were grown and a fortified camp constructed, but things started to sour pretty quickly. The crops had been planted during the short end of the rainy season, and soon perished. The French and Dutch had erected colonies at nearby Antangier and Saint-Luce, and threatened hostile action. As for the Malagasy, they were receptive at first, but when realizing that the English lacked the cornelian beads they desired, and were settling their territory, they too turned a new leaf, a sharp, poisonous leaf. Disease began taking its toll, and in 1646, the colony was abandoned. A preacher made a second attempt at a colony in 1650, citing a lack of faith and willingness to convert the heathens as the reason for previous failures. The Providence Island Company, responsible for colonizing an island used for anti-Spanish piracy in the Caribbean, considered colonizing the island of Asada, off Madagascar. The goal was to take their Protestant crusade against the Mughal Empire, but it was never to be, at least for now. The biggest antagonist to English colonization appears to have been Adrian Dai Fotsi, often simply called Lai Fotsi, Prince of the Sakalava. A powerful military state, they had expanded from the Sakalava tributary of the Mangoki River during the middle of the 17th century. Within a few years, Lai Fotsi had carved out a decently sized kingdom through battle with his neighbors, now commanding an army of some 12,000 troops, many of them armed with flintlock muskets. His wealth was measured in 126,000 heads of cattle, no doubt taken as plunder or rustled, an activity which to this day remains part of coming-of-age rituals in certain parts of Madagascar. In one of his early victories, he allegedly put a huge, red-colored ox in a ditch and covered it up. When the enemy arrived, the bellowing of the ox appeared supernatural and seemed to come from the ground itself. The red ox would apparently give the name of Menabey to his kingdom, meaning Big Red. But it could simply have been drawn from the Malagasy association of red with royalty. The aforementioned colony erected by the Dutch was short-lived like the English, but its history is poorly documented. The French were more successful. In 1642, Cardinal Richelieu granted a monopoly charter to the French Society of the Orient, which immediately dispatched an expedition to the Red Island. They arrived in September of the same year, really a Madagascar any percent speedrun, hoisted a fleur-de-lis, and by the end of the next year had constructed Fort Dauphin at a narrow, defensible peninsula on the southern coast. The fort was named in honor of Louis XIV, already the King of France, though still an infant. Dauphin, meaning dolphin, was an excellent choice for a European colony. Apart from its defensibility, the southern location provided a cool weather, and the surrounding nature appears quite idyllic. The soil was decent enough for varied cultivation, and the locals friendly enough. Called the Antanosi, they already had experience working with Europeans, and many of them were lighter-skinned descendants of shipwrecked Portuguese sailors. Their king had even lived in the Portuguese colony of Goa, and though baptized, had swiftly returned to his native practices. Trade relations were established, in which ebony, hides and beeswax were exported back to France. Dauphin would swiftly become a pirate hideout. In 1644, 47 and 54, the English made reports of French vessels sailing out of Dauphin and robbing Muslim ships in the Red Sea, taking home, quote-unquote, great booty. But it is Madagascar we're speaking of, so, of course, things could not be stable. The governor of Dauphin, Sieur Prony, married the niece of the Antanosy chief, a decision highly unpopular with the French settlers. Prony was likewise a Protestant Huguenot among a Catholic flock. In 1646 the settlers mutinied and Prony put in jail. A few months later he was rescued by a relief force. Though he had promised amnesty, Prony decided instead to exile 12 of the mutineers to the then uninhabited island of Bourbon, nowadays called Réunion. Ironically, this was the beginning of one of France's most important colonies in the area. He also arranged the killing of a local chief, who had cuckolded him during his imprisonment. Excusable for sure. Less excusable was his deceiving of 73 Malagasy, enticing them into the fort and then selling them into slavery. Friendly relations with the Antanosy were exchanged for hostility. Realizing Prony's questionable leadership, a replacement was sent in the form of Etienne de Flacoux and a limited relief force. France was currently facing a civil war. Etienne managed to stop the blood flow, but was unable to mend the wound. He sent Prony's wife back to her people, but couldn't prevent the dwindling of trade and squabbling between settlers. The Antanosy launched a major attack on Dauphin, consisting of several thousand troops, but they were driven off by artillery. Etienne responded with an assault on the Antanosy capital, destroying it and killing the chief. The natives had been subdued, but the situation remained dire. After a failed escape in 1653, Etienne finally left the island in 55, leaving Dauphin once more in the hands of Prony's. Though Etienne had obviously not abandoned hope, he wrote 2 books giving a detailed insight into the history, nature and customs of the island, including a list of advantages to colonizing it. In 1660 he embarked once more for this New Eden, but was attacked by the Barbary corsairs and killed along with most of his crew. As you might have guessed, Prony's wasn't doing too well. Shortly after Etienne's departure, the fort was destroyed by fire, and Prony's finally succumbed to a fever. The succeeding governors proved violent, including a military commander from France named Champmargous. Attempts were made at converting the Antanosy, but the chief was reluctant to give up polygamy. The missionary was eventually killed, and the retaliatory strike resulted in even more bloodshed. Champmargous was narrowly rescued by another Frenchman named Lacasse, who had married the daughter of another chief and become a Malagasy prince himself. Throughout these extreme ups and downs, Dauphin had been reduced to a beleaguered ruin. Louis XIV had now grown into a young man and was thoroughly interested in expanding French overseas interests. The new Company of the East Indies was established in 1664, and thousands of settlers and soldiers sent east. Control was extended over a larger part of Madagascar, but lack of good leadership and a clear policy led to mismanagement. Fort Dauphin was abandoned in 1674 after a peculiar incident. Louis XIV had recruited a score of young women from an orphanage to marry the male settlers on the colony on Bourbon. But when the women were stranded on Dauphin, they feared being abandoned and begged the governor of Dauphin to let them marry the men of his colony instead. The men of Dauphin happily agreed, but the Malagasy women they had spent their time with did not. So they went to their male relatives, and on August 27, 1674, in the middle of the marriage festivities, half of the settlers were massacred. Hell hath no fury, etc. The idea of a European colony on Madagascar would not be entertained for almost a century. Whenever a ship sailed to the East Indies, Madagascar was typically ignored. An exception was made by pirates and slave traders, and their involvement on the island would flip the dynamic on its head. As early as 1641, the Dutch began importing Malagasy slaves for their colonies in Batavia and especially Cape Town. By the late 17th century, the Batavian connection had been discontinued, but a slave ship went between Cape Town and Madagascar on an almost annual basis. For the English, the situation was entirely different. They had no colonies in the region in need of slaves, but their American plantations faced a huge demand. Most of the slaves came from West Africa, either stolen from Dutch or Portuguese vessels, or legally traded by the Royal African Company. The RAC possessed a monopoly on the English slave trade, but were unable to meet the massive demand for human labor. However, a few clever interlopers soon discovered a legal loophole. The monopoly only applied to the Atlantic. Madagascar and the Indian Ocean lay within the charter limits of the East India Company, who did not trade in slaves. In 1676, a colonial report claimed that Barbados had a population of over 32,000 slaves from Guinea and Madagascar. In Boston they were 200. The Madagascar slave trade had become frequent enough to warrant complaint from both the RAC and EIC. Though the EIC did not bother with the slave trade, they did consider Madagascar to be under their jurisdiction, and many of the interlopers likewise carried goods from India and beyond, which they were supposed to have a monopoly on. They asserted the right to seize the ships and goods of pirates and interlopers, considering them one and the same. The journey from the New World to Madagascar was more than twice as long as the one to West Africa, but it was sort of legal and incredibly cheap. It was estimated that it would cost only 10 shillings in goods to purchase a single slave at Madagascar, in contrast to the sum of £4 in West Africa. The slaves could then be sold at the same price regardless of origins, so the return on investment was massive. The voyages were usually undertaken with small ships and crews, further reducing the overhead. Slavers would go up and down the western coast, making call at different ports until they found a suitable contact. Jacob de Bucquoy wrote how the Malagasy kept watchtowers all around the island. As soon as a ship was spotted, the scouts would come aboard to discover where it came from and to which nation it belonged. The Malagasy could be spoken with in Arabic, Portuguese, but eventually they would learn English, owing to the prominence of English visitors. Malagasy slaves could also be used as interpreters once they had learned English. Negotiations could take weeks. First, the local ruler was gifted a musket or pair of pistols. In return, he'd give a fine bullock and treat his visitors to a meal. Boiled rice with some protein, chicken, mutton or beef, served on a palm leaf. Though they enjoyed foreign arak, rum and European spirits, they also had a native liquor called toke, made from honey and the leaves of the chickpea bush. At first, the Malagasy would try and sell weak, female or elderly slaves, who were not highly valued. The Europeans wanted young men. These were exchanged for silver, usually Spanish, beads, and brass or copper wire. Towards the end of the 17th century, it became more common to sell muskets. One scholar went so far as to suggest that the sale of firearms through pirates and slavers made a significant contribution to the rise of powerful kingdoms on the island. The theory is interesting but lacks solid foundations. Indeed, both slavers and pirates would often sell poor quality muskets, manufactured specifically to be sold. They were prone to exploding. Eventually, the Malagasy would learn to disassemble the firearms and make quality control. The type of musket sold to the Malagasy is a recurring star on the channel, the buccaneer gun. Favorite of Caribbean hunters, the Red Seamen, and pirates of all sorts. Renowned for its accuracy, it had an absurdly long barrel, about 6 feet, much taller than the average contemporary height. One such musket and a trade gun, 2 pounds of powder, 30 flints and 30 bullets could buy you a male slave. 2 trade guns could buy a woman, 1 buccaneer gun, a young boy. In some cases, negotiations could break into hostilities, especially in the early days. In one incident, a crew of Englishmen were invited to a chief's camp, when they were suddenly beset upon, killed or captured. The Malagasy then snuck aboard the English ship, where they were treated to dinner. In the middle of the meal, they pulled concealed spearheads out from their loincloths and ambushed their host. They killed several men and managed to loot the captain's cabin, taking his sword and some alcohol, but were eventually driven off by the sailors, firing from the rigging and close quarters. But these hostilities should not be viewed as random acts of savagery. Just how the Europeans struggled at differentiating between the many different tribes, often simply referring to the Malagasy as Negroes, same as continental Africans. The Malagasy could not differentiate between different Europeans, let alone different crews. Neither could they distinguish between pirates, interlopers, company, or navy. Whenever they acted with hostility, it was usually as revenge for Europeans previously attacking or trying to steal from them. Key to the flourishing slave market was the constant infighting between the different tribes. Wars broke out over territory, or cattle. Robert Drury, a shipwrecked sailor who lived among the Malagasy for 14 years, remarked the following: "The epidemical evil of this island is their frequent quarrels with one another, and the very cause so many of them are sold to the Europeans, for slaves." The rise of powerful warlords, the frequent conflicts, abundance of slaves, and importation of firearms all appears to coincide on Madagascar from the mid-17th century onwards. It all seems a bit convenient, but since the history is quite poorly documented, one should be warned against making any hasty conclusion. There is seldom only one cause behind an effect. Anyway, the three most powerful states on Madagascar were the three Sakalava kingdoms. Most powerful was Menabe, now headed by the son of Laifotsi, Ratzimongarivo, or Garivo, I guess we can call him, Gary. Robert Drury described him as a very odd and terrible figure, his hair twisted in knots, a gold chain around his neck, and of a tawny complexion more akin to an Indian. His whole appearance was frightful. Then there was Andrian Tuakafo, known to pirates and slave traders as Long Dick or King Dick. I'll let you imagine why. Then there was the Antakarana kingdom, situated in the northwest of the island. More valuable than guns might have been the men to hold them. For this reason, pirates were especially valued. Shipwrecked sailors were treated hospitably by the Malagasy, who valued the skills of these desperate men. Many of the pirates were former buccaneers who had experience fighting the Spanish in guerrilla-style skirmishing tactics and jungle warfare. Intertribal warfare on Madagascar was absolutely brutal. The Malagasy traveled by water in dugout canoes, seeking out unsuspecting prey. Battles were usually fought to capture cattle or slaves. At range they threw sagayis, iron darts with poisoned tips, and engaged in melee with short spears and shields. The warriors on both sides often numbered in the thousands, and the aftermath could be gruesome. There are accounts of infants being torn from their mothers' breasts, and their brains dashed out against the rocks. Aside from fighting themselves, pirates could train and command native warriors. Many of them would even become princes among the Malagasy, take local wives, and build small settlements to facilitate trade with other pirates or slave traders. Madagascar in this period was a natural pirate base, and in a give or take 40-year period between roughly 1685 and 1725, the Red Island would form the epicenter of international piracy. And pirates were not interested in the island itself. Their ambition was the same as that of the companies, the riches of the Orient. They would commonly sail to Bab el Mandeb, the entry to the Red Sea, and prey on wealthy passengers traveling on pilgrimage to Mecca. Discussing whether pirates or slavers were the first to stop by at Madagascar is a kind of chicken or the egg debate. The idea of the pirate round appears to have been around as far back as 1508, but expeditions, though profitable, occurred but occasionally until around 1685. By now, it was becoming more dangerous and less profitable for the buccaneers to engage in their old activities in the Caribbean. Rumors of the Eastern riches would have spread from slave traders and other pirates who had already made a voyage, and this would snowball. Slavers and pirates appear to have worked in close conjunction, trading supplies, captives no doubt, crucial information, and pirates would often seek passage back home aboard slave ships. A lot of them would switch between the two professions on a whim. Geographically, Madagascar was a perfect pirate base. Absolutely massive in size, it was devoid of authorities and guarded by jagged reefs to smash any Royal Navy encroachments. The innumerable bays and inlets were unable to house larger vessels, but perfect for concealing the smaller craft used by pirates. On the long, sloping beaches, they could easily careen their ships to scrape away barnacles, make repairs and replace rotting timber. Sea battles, and especially the teredo worm, preying on woodwork in tropical waters, would wear down their ships and demand constant maintenance. Disease and rotting ships was arguably more of an issue to the Red Seamen than Mughals, Malagasy, or companies. And if the pirates were somehow discovered along the 5,600-kilometer long coastline, they could simply retreat inland. The natives were friendly or easily subdued, and provided them with ample stores of water, fruit, meat, and rice. Pirates would make landfall at several different points across Madagascar. The west coast hosted the best anchorages, such as St. Augustine and Masselage, but the region was unsuitable for a permanent base, owing to the arbitrary temper of the Sakalava kings. Pirates benefited most from the Malagasy being weak and decentralized. Instead, they would come to prefer Antongil Bay and the nearby island of St. Mary. It can hardly be believed that the small, tranquil island of St. Mary was ever the hotspot of international piracy, that the idyllic scenery was once perverted by the noisome debauchery and brutalities of the Red Seamen, returning from their successful expeditions. Music, gunfire, laughter, the barking of dogs, screams of love and pain. Deep into the pitch-black night, countless fires would have cast their embers into the star-speckled sky. It is a slender island, at the southern end of which lies a circular lagoon, protected by a narrow and easily fortified entrance. In the middle of the lagoon lies an island still called L'Île aux Faubourgs, Pirates Island. Treasure hunts have proved fruitless. Lying on the still tropical side of Madagascar, the fertile surroundings provided ample provisions of beef, chicken, fish, turtle, yams, bananas, pineapples, coconuts, rice, taro, oranges, lemons, palm oil, and honey. The diet of the Red Seamen would have been more colorful than what the popular imagination envisions to be the diet of pirates, at least on land. Yet, for so long, St. Mary went unnoticed. That was until 1690, when Adam Baldridge made landfall. Baldridge is a fascinating and unscrupulous figure. It is said that in 1685 he murdered one of his comrades during a bar fight in Jamaica. He joined a pirate ship, either cruising the Caribbean, South Sea, or perhaps even the Indian Ocean. How true this backstory is we cannot know for certain, but Baldridge must have had some experience, as he certainly proved to be a skilled tactician and a ruthless entrepreneur. By 1690 he had ended up in New York, where he found employ under one Frederick Phillips, a Dutchman who had emigrated to the city in his youth. He would soon become its wealthiest citizen. Phillips and his brother had previously made dealings with pirates, but it's uncertain whether they approached Baldridge or the other way around. The idea was that by setting up a middleman to act as a medium between slaves or pirates and the Malagasy, the process of trade and interaction could be made more efficient. He must certainly have caught wind of the profits made by New York slavers and pirates traveling to Madagascar, and realized how he could earn a cut by setting up a trading post on the island. By having an agent to act as the middleman between the pirates, slavers, and Malagasy, the process would be made quicker for everyone. It crucially provided pirates with a safe place to stay during the monsoon season, which prevented them from going out and sailing. It also allowed them to stay in the region for longer, with hopes of getting more or better prices, and also an opportunity to buy European goods like liquor, clothing, and Bibles. Baldridge arrived on St. Mary on the 17th of July, 1690. Most of his associates died or abandoned him, apart from his young apprentice, John King. Baldridge and King joined the local Malagasy as mercenaries, earning them a starting capital of 70 heads of cattle and a number of slaves. Using them as labor, he constructed himself a house on a hill overlooking the harbor. Here he was approached by several Malagasy, whom he allied by helping them rescue their wives and children kidnapped by a rival clan. To facilitate this alliance, he married a local woman. However, the alliance was not on equal footing, and Baldridge never assimilated into Malagasy society. By 1696 he had constructed a small fort around his home, segregating himself from the locals, with a battery of 14 cannons. In 1699, Baldridge wrote a deposition detailing his settling on St. Mary, and at least some of the transactions he made. Let's take a look. His first customer arrived on the 13th of October, 1691. The pirate ship Bachelor's Delight, commanded by George Rayner. He had recently taken a Mughal ship and doled out about £1,100 per man, a sizable fortune. While careening their ship, Baldridge supplied them with cattle in return for beads, flour, iron, shot and powder, and 5 cannons with which to fortify his growing stockade. They stayed for about a month. The next year arrived in Nassau, commanded by Edward Coates. They too had taken a prize, with every man earning a share of £500. Whilst they careened, he supplied them with cattle, and the Malagasy gave them chicken, rice, and yams. In return he got gunpowder, 6 cannons, spikes, nails, and flour. He mentions how both the Bachelor and Nassau victualled at Fort Dauphin. As far as I know, the French colony had been abandoned 20 years prior. Maybe the Malagasy were still using the ruins as a trading hub. A pirate named Abraham Samuels would later build a colony there, But more on that in a bit. Back to Baldridge. In August of 1693, arrived a ship owned by Frederick Phillips, containing goods for Baldridge to sell to the pirates. These consisted of 44 pairs of shoes and pumps, 3 dozen stockings, 3 dozen speckled shirts and breeches, 12 hats, carpenter's tools, 5 barrels of rum, 4 casks of Madeira wine, 10 cases of spirits, 2 old stills full of holes, a worm, 2 grindstones, 3 saws, 3 jars of oil, 2 small iron pots, several books, catechisms, primers and hornbooks, 2 Bibles, garden seeds, and 3 dozen hoes. The tools, that is. Most of these items were trade necessities sought by the pirates, and some of them were needed for the colony. In return, Baldridge gave them 1,100 pieces of eight, 34 slaves, 15 heads of cattle, and 57 bars of iron. The ship stayed for 2 months. On the 19th of October arrived the Amity, commanded by Thomas II. He had recently taken his first prize in the Red Sea, every fellow earning a share of £1,200. They bought most of their provisions from the Malagasy, but Baldridge sold them cattle, and several of the American goods brought in by Phillips. The Amity stayed for almost a month. On the 6th of August, 1695, arrived the Charming Mary from Barbados, commanded by Richard Glover. Baldridge bought most of their goods. In December of the same year, he sold these goods to the pirate crew of the Susanna, one of the ships which had accompanied Henry Every. The Susanna stayed until April, and while they were relaxing, the Amity showed up again, Thomas II now having been killed in battle. This is where things get interesting. The crew of the Amity, seemingly upset over missing the Pilgrim fleet and losing their captain, must have been made jealous of the fine goods bought by the Susanna. So Baldridge appears to have given them the course of the Charming Mary, because the Amity cast off and captured her. They then changed ships with Captain Glover, elected a new commander, and sailed to the Indies. Apparently they were imprisoned by the Mughals. Glover carried the Amity back to the Americas. The next year Glover returned aboard the Amity, having now refitted her with a second mast into a brigantine by the owners of the Charming Mary. Baldridge bought some of her goods, but whilst lying in the harbour, the Amity was attacked by Dirk Shivers, who plundered her casks, sails, rigging, and masts, leaving the Amity but a floating hull adrift on a reef. Shivers was now in command of the Resolution, a pirate ship previously commanded by a man also named Glover, Robert instead of Richard, no relation. When Robert had refused to carry the men into the Red Sea, Shivers had mutinied. Now he offered Robert his old captaincy if he'd change his mind, but Robert refused. So Shivers and the gang left without him. Richard's fate is uncertain. Baldridge was watching all of this from the comfort of his fort, no doubt rubbing his hands and giggling like a goblin. Speaking of goblins, a quick word from today's sponsor. Are you tired of never seeing the sun? Of cold and rain? Of bad food, bad-teethed women? Do you want to change the scenery? A fresh new start? Have you recently killed your best friend in a bar fight? Then I have the solution for you. St. Mary's Island, Madagascar. On this beautiful island with its golden beaches, a 5-star resort has just been opened up by Adam Baldridge, the sponsor of this video. They have everything. Good barbecue, fresh fruits, fresh pussy, and totally well-paid and consenting servants to attend your every need. But please don't drink the water, we don't need more people shitting themselves to death. So what are you waiting for? Book passage today aboard one of our ships in New York, Barbados, or Jamaica, and come down to St. Mary's Island, where the liquor is good and the lasses are gay. Adam Baldridge nor Phillips Brothers will not be held responsible nor provide insurance if you die from disease during the journey to St. Mary, if you are captured by pirates, shipwrecked and enslaved by the Malagasy, if you die from malaria, dysentery, syphilis, or any other disease, poisoned arrows, poisonous fish, rogue cannonballs, duels or plunder, or if you are bad with hot iron by the East India Company, or forcibly circumcised by the Moors. Thank you to Adam Baldridge and the Phillips Brothers for sponsoring this video. Please hit the subscribe button and notification bell. For all the good and fresh food, alcohol and company of women, Madagascar could not be considered anything but a hellscape. The thing which struck me the most during the research of this video was the incredible frequency of diseases. The mortality rates were incredibly high. Recall 1/3 of the Fort Dauphin colonists dying in a year, all of Baldridge's companions dropping like flies, Robert Culliford's crew all dying, leaving him unable to leave, Irish pirate Captain Hoare dying from a disease. When you read the first-hand accounts, deaths from disease are so common that they are but a side note, a triviality. There was no air conditioning, few Europeans would have been able to handle the weather alone, let alone the swarms of insects and their malaria, or dying from flux or dysentery after drinking bad water. It is easy to romanticize this period of piracy owing to the beautiful tropical climate, but owing to the extreme brutality and rampant diseases, it was more like a Euronymous Bosch painting come alive. In 1697, Baldridge had gotten tired of the sedentary life and decided to buy shares in a brigantine from Boston. Having careened her, he took her on a trading trip to several other points at Madagascar. About a week after his departure, the Malagasy rose up and killed 30 of the pirates on St. Mary, looting all of Baldridge's possessions. So why did they rise up against Baldridge? According to him, it were his men that had abused and stolen cattle from the Malagasy. A reliable source, I'm sure. According to Captain Kidd, who arrived the next year, Baldridge had tricked several of his Malagasy allies aboard his ship and forced them into slavery. Kidd had learned this from the surviving pirates. No doubt, both parties had an interest in telling their side of the story, so the truth remains uncertain. Baldridge returned to New York, where he approached the governor with the idea of founding a colony on St. Mary, but they did not trust him. His ultimate fate is uncertain. Some allege that he illegally married the wife of a dead pirate and died himself in his 70s. Others that he managed to get a trading license, but became a pirate instead. But it wasn't long before pirates had re-established themselves on St. Mary, led by a New Englander named Edward Welch. Known to the Malagasy as Little King, owing to his height, he lived in a fortified hilltop compound 4 miles from the main harbor. Visitors had to creep up a single zigzag path and cross through stone walls, fortified with cannon. Inside was a trading post, tavern, and whorehouse all combined into one. The interior was furnished with Eastern plunder, silver teapots, Persian carpets, and striped silk hanging in the windows. Welch bought and sold plunder, provided women and liquor, and even Malagasy mercenaries. Here he treated pirates like Robert Culliford and William Kidd, 2 rivals against whose both sides Welch played both. He stored Captain Kidd's treasure chest, but allowed Culliford's men to ransack it. He likewise bought some of Kidd's stolen textiles from his mutineers. However, Welch did not only trade with Europeans. By 1697, Arab traders from Mombasa and Zanzibar had begun to frequent St. Mary's, looking to buy pirate plunder at cheap rates. It's unknown if Baldridge ever traded with them. The success of the St. Mary colony has been debated upon. Some say it prospered under Baldridge, others under Welch. Some say it didn't really prosper at all. In 1691, Phillips wrote a letter to Baldridge, complaining that the 34 slaves he received were quite useless, 15 being children and 3 of them still suckling babes. For slave trading, independent action directly between interlopers and Malagasy appears to have been more efficient, but also more dangerous and challenging. Of course, trading at St. Mary never guaranteed your safety. Just look at the unfortunate incidents of Captain Richard Glover. Fool him once, shame on him. Fool him twice, maybe he should have learned the first time. The Madagascar pirates were now becoming a problem for England, where inflated traveler stories portrayed Madagascar as some sort of paradise where Henry Every had established an independent republic. It was said that 1,500 pirates lived on St. Mary, in a castle of 40 or 50 cannon, and that they could muster a fleet of 17 ships, 7 of which were large and armed with more than 24 cannon. It was a gross exaggeration. At its height, 300 pirates at most inhabited St. Mary. Baldridge's fort never carried more guns than a dozen, and the ships in the harbor never seemed to have counted above 5 or 6, most of them sloops and brigantines. Still, the legend was believed by a certain Commodore Warren, who set out with a fleet to end the pirate kingdom. He ended up on the wrong side of Madagascar and never saw a single pirate. Instead, his nephew, only sailing in a small pink, managed to reach St. Mary with the intention of buying slaves and handing out royal pardons to the pirates. Welch had been wounded in a skirmish and retired as an advisor at the court of a Sakalava king. Culliford had taken over in his stead, and he and 14 colleagues were glad to accept the pardon. A handful were absent or flat out refused. When Commodore Warren finally arrived in 1699, they constructed earthwork batteries and blocked the harbor by sinking several ships, including the infamous Mocha frigate and Soldado. All other ships and all of their plunder was burned, in order to deprive the enemy of any profits. To their surprise, Warren didn't want to fight, he only wanted to extend the Act of Grace again. Some of the pirates accepted it, others believed it to be a ruse, and fled inland. One of the survivors was a Dutchman named John Pro. Though most of his life remains mysterious and undocumented, he appears to have been running the outpost on St. Mary between around 1700 and 1719. There is scarce documentation of his transactions, and he appears to have shifted between sailing and landlubbery, depending on the circumstance. At one point he was captured by the Navy, escaped, and joined a pirate crew, before eventually settling down on St. Mary's again. Most of his story was related through the unreliable A General History of the Pirates, but his existence has been confirmed through several first-hand accounts. Most important is the journal of Robert Drury, who met John Pro and visited St. Mary in 1717. It says the following: "By this time came in the two white men abreast, making a formidable and hostile appearance. One was a Dutchman named John Pro, who spoke good English. He was dressed in a short coat with broad plate buttons and other things agreeable, but without shoes or stockings. In his sash stuck a brace of pistols, and one in his hand. Pro took Drury to St. Mary's Island, where he and his companions were mediating slave trade between the local king and Europeans. The settlement on St. Mary was described as follows. John Pro lived in a very handsome manner. His house was furnished with pewter dishes, etc., a standing bed with curtains, and other things of that nature, except chairs. But a chest or two served for that use well enough. He had one house on purpose for his cook room, and cook slaves' lodging, storehouse and summer house. All of these enclosed in a palisade, as the great men's houses are in this country. For he was rich, had many cattle, and slaves." The fate of John Pro is uncertain. He was reported dead in 1719. Though Fort Dauphin had been abandoned in 1674, it appears as though it was still maintained as a gathering point for trade between the Malagasy and European visitors. By the late 17th century, it had been established as a stronghold of a mulatto pirate king named Abraham Samuel. It is one of the strangest and most fascinating tales in pirate history. Abraham Samuel was born on the French island of Martinique to an African mother and a French father. Some sources claim he was a slave and escaped, but it's not certain. In 1695 he had signed aboard the John and Rebecca, a pirate ship bound for the Red Sea. Having successfully taken a prize, she sailed next to Madagascar to resupply. At St. Mary's, the captain and much of his crew died from disease, and Abraham was elected quartermaster. But after leaving St. Mary, they were wrecked off Fort Dauphin. Dauphin was now ruled by a Malagasy woman, who many years prior had borne a son to a French settler. The child had since been taken away when the French left Dauphin. When the woman saw Abraham bathing, she noticed several marks on his back, identical to those of her son. Embracing him, she declared Abraham to be her long-lost son, and crowned him the chief of her tribe. Samuel had no complaints. Holed up in a fortified compound, he kept a palace guard of pirates, and called himself the King of Dauphin. At the height of his power, he commanded 300 warriors and 15 war canoes. He would broker deals between pirates, interlopers, and the Malagasy. Unlike previous interactions, Abraham formalized these dealings in written documents, signed by Abraham Samuel, King of Fort Dauphin, Tolonair, Farawi, Fanquest, Fonshahira, and sealed with a large wax seal bearing his presumed coat of arms, a lamb, and a cross upon an octagonal shield. 2 such documents have been preserved to this day, one signed Tolinar Rex. Abraham had a tendency of luring merchants ashore and then deceiving them. In 1698 arrived future mayor of New York, John Kruger, looking to buy slaves. While Abraham treated him to dinner, Kruger's ship was seized by pirates, also from New York. Kruger hired some of Abraham's men to fire on the vessel, but it did little damage. In turn, the pirates paid Abraham a pourboire for his protection. They also sold him Kruger's ship and 55 slaves. Abraham then sold the ship to 4 pirates for 1,400 pieces of 8. When Kruger complained, Abraham confiscated the rest of his cargo and left him stranded, until he was picked up by Captain Warren, the same guy who had offered Culliford his pardon. Abraham's fate is unknown. According to Robert Drury, Abraham was at constant war with the king of the Antanosy. In 1705, he seems to have fallen in battle. His exact fate is uncertain. Still, as a man of mixed-race origin, he definitely pulled a good card out of life, when many men like him ended up as slaves or otherwise discriminated against. In 1707, the slave post at Fort Dauphin was taken over by a former pirate, Thomas Collins. He would operate the post until 1719, and frequently interacted with the previously aforementioned John Pro. In 1714 he was even visited by Woodes Rogers. He was looking to buy slaves, but also interested in pardoning the Madagascar pirates and establishing an English colony. Rogers, like so many other officials in London, had been swayed by legends and popular stories, in which Madagascar was a pirate paradise. This was the root of the eventual Libertalia legend. Most of the pirates had died from disease, and there were only around 250 of them distributed across the entire island. Some stayed by choice, others because they were afraid of the authorities, or because their ships had been destroyed. Some were even enslaved by the Malagasy, though enslavement as a white man wasn't the worst. You'd be relegated to duties such as palace guard, officer, a farmhand at worst, but your freedom was still restricted. Most of the pirates lived like petty kings. Their expertise in warfare was highly valued. According to Captain Charles Johnson, these pirates eventually came to possess harems of women and small tribes of slaves, dividing themselves into little princedoms. Fear of their neighbors made them tyrannical and paranoid. They lived in fortified dwellings, situated near a water source and surrounded by earthen ramparts and a ditch, impossible to climb without ladders. The entrances to these compounds were like labyrinths. Scouts were constantly sent out to search for enemies. The accuracy of Johnson's account is questionable, but other sources confirmed similar fortifications on Madagascar, fenced by thorny bushes, wooden walls armed with cannons, etc. Years of living among the heathen would have torn their clothes, grown their hairs and scorched their skins. Johnson described how they looked like the pictures of Hercules in the lion's skin. Robert Drury, when he first encountered fellow Europeans, was not recognized as a white man until he had a shave and a new set of clothes. He had also forgotten how to speak English and had to relearn it. Between 1703 and 1719, pirates did operate several trading posts on Madagascar. John Pro at St. Mary's, David Watkin at Masselage, Arthur Gardiner at Mariton, Collins at Dauphin, and John Rivers at St. Augustine's. They seem to have acted as mediums between Europeans and the local kings. Both pirates and slave traders were frequent enough in the area, but their stories are poorly documented. Rogers saw no use in pardons or a colony, which the East India Company disliked anyway, but he would recycle his Madagascar plan for the Caribbean, offering pardons to the pirates of Nassau and restoring British rule as the new governor. The frequency of pirates on Madagascar left a contemporary mark on the Malagasy population. Many of them would learn to speak English, and even gave their sons and daughters English names, like the Princess Eleanor Brown. Since they were unable to discern between pirates and regular sailors, they adopted pirate rituals as part of welcoming ceremonies. When a Royal Navy squadron came looking for pirates on St. Mary in 1722, the local king came aboard and offered a glass of salt water mixed with gunpowder, compelling his visitors to swear friendship by the sea. Captains were usually offered one or more daughters as a present. Sex was a natural result of these friendly interactions, and the Malagasy were especially free with their women. Tribal men and even the kings would lend out their wives for visitors to have sex with. This wasn't seen as dishonoring, since the powerful men practiced polygamy, taking as many women as possible. Fathers would also offer their daughters in a temporary marriage until the pirate left. Jacob de Bucquoy wrote how whenever a traveler stopped at a friend's house, he'd be offered one of the women after the footbath and evening meal. But Bucquoy also stresses that this might only have been the case in certain parts of Madagascar, and similar customs existed in other countries like Siam and Pegu. It was also considered honorable for the women, as it gave them a higher status in society. Whiter-skinned offspring were also more desired. There was a sizable caste of mixed-raced pirate offspring on Madagascar, known as Malatta or Zana Malatta. Their descendants can still be identified today, some of them having reddish hair or blue eyes. Some of the contemporary Zana Malattas even claim to be the descendants of famous pirates. Mulatto Tom claimed to be the son of Henry Every. A fleet under Commodore Matthews was dispatched to deal with them. When he finally arrived on St. Mary in 1722, the pirate colony was an abandoned ruin. He believed the old fort constructed by Baldridge to have belonged to Every. It must have been overgrown, flocking with birds, and possibly not dissimilar to the Libertalia presented in the Uncharted game. The pirates had burned several of their ships in the harbour, and left a bunch of plunder on the shore. The Malagasy had no interest in it and left it alone. Matthews was soon visited by a white man, accompanied by 20 Malagasy. He asked this fellow where the pirates were. The man said they had sailed to America to seek pardons from the Spanish. Disappointed, Matthews asked the man's name. He said he was John Plantain, the King of Ranter Bay. Born in Port Royal, Jamaica, at Chocolate Hole where ships careened, John Plantain appears to have been born around 1697. At 13 years of age he became a privateer and logwood cutter, and at 23 he became a pirate. He and his comrades sailed to Guinea, led by Captain Edward England. After taking a few prizes, England was seemingly deposed and marooned, but several of his men decided to retire from piracy with their loot and settled down on Madagascar. Among this group were John Plantain and 2 of his friends, Scotsman James Adair and Danish Hans Bergen. Just north of St. Mary lies a deep bay called Antangel, known to the pirates as Ranter Bay. This is where Plantain and his buddies set up shop. They insinuated themselves among the local inhabitants, likely partaking as mercenaries in their conflicts, soon allowing them to construct grand estates and set up little empires. At Plantain's house he maintained a legion of servants, mercenary warriors and several wives. These he called by English names like Moll, Kate, Sue or Peg. He dressed them in the finest silks and diamond necklaces. However, his true item of desire was Eleanor Brown, the daughter of the King of the Boina, Long Dick. She was said to have English blood in her. But when Plantain sent a request for marriage, several of his old crewmen, who had taken up court with King Dick, obliged him to refuse. Upon receiving this message of defiance, Plantain mustered an army of pirates and Malagasy warriors. Plantain's general was Mulatto Tom, a Zana mulatta who claimed to be the son of Henry Every, even though he was near 40 years of age, and thus older than Henry Every's first documented visit to the island. Some speculated that he might have been the offspring of a pirate, and one of the Indian women raped during the Red Sea exploits. Tom said he could not remember his mother. He apparently resembled the Bengalese, having long, dark hair. Plantain's party flew an English flag, whereas Audace flew the Scottish colours of St. Andrews, and Hans Bergen the Danish flag. The battle ended with Plantain's victory. The pirates that had fought for King Dick were forced to run barefoot over hot coals, while the Malagasy threw spears at them. All of them allegedly died. The campaign carried on for 2 brutal years, Plantain battling both pirate princes and Malagasy chiefs. His enemies were usually executed or tortured to death. Many pirates would take to roaming banditry, and when captured by the Malagasy, they were tortured in their own fashion, by having burning match cords tied around their fingers. But when Plantain finally captured King Dick and the apple of his eye, it turned out that she had been made pregnant by one of Plantain's now deceased enemies. Enraged, Plantain put the king to death and all of the pirates who had fought for him. He looted his treasures and sent it back to Ranter Bay. The inhabitants were made slaves and forced to work at newly erected sugar plantations. As for Eleanor, she did not seem displeased with Plantain, and apparently they had several children together. She had been raised a Christian, but with no access to the Bible, and so pestered Plantain with many questions. Plantain had now subdued several parts of Madagascar, and called himself King of Ranter Bay. His exploits were celebrated in song, and every day he was entertained by dances. Vassal tribes paid him tribute in cattle, rice, and sugar. Plantain marched south on Fort Dauphin, possessed by one of his rivals, King Kelly. He mounted artillery on carriages and laid siege. Men, women, and children were put to the sword, and when the fort had been toppled, the defenders and Kelly himself were tortured to death. He now called himself King of all Madagascar, but this seems unlikely. Plantain shared most of this story in his own deposition, retold to naval officer Clement Downing. He may have taken some creative liberties with the narrative. It is quite a romantic story, but there are certainly grains of truth in it. Plantain tired of his Madagascar life, and simply decided to depart. He constructed a sloop, salvaging the rudder and ironwork from a shipwreck. He sailed to India, where he introduced himself to Kanoji Angria, Admiral of the Maratha Navy at Alibag. The Admiral was so impressed by Plantain's story that he entertained him with a lavish celebration and recruited him into his service. His ultimate fate, and how much of the story is true, is unknown. But even if extreme, It pronounces the dynamic on Madagascar between pirates and Malagasy. Pirates were destroyers, not builders. They left no permanent memorial on Madagascar. There is allegedly a pirate cemetery on St. Mary, but the remains inside have never been identified. The ruins of Baldridge's fort have rotted away. As for the pirates who remained on the island, most of them appear to have perished by 1730 through malaria, dysentery, and the countless interfighting, both between the tribes and the pirates. Visitors described them as incredibly violent. They would often walk around with naked swords, always expecting a fight. At one point, when unable to divide their plunder, 14 of them divided themselves into 2 parties and battled it out in a mass duel. A short life and a merry one indeed. Some would even be poisoned by their wives for treating them badly or threatening to abandon them. The widows of pirates could be seen dressed in fine Indian clothes, with golden jewelry and even diamonds, all just a visible sample of their considerable inheritance. The tribes of the northeast had been small and decentralized, but the importation of firearms and pirate mercenaries allowed them to resist and eventually go on the offense against the more powerful Sakalava. The riches of the north aroused the envy of the south, and soon a struggle would erupt between the Antatsimo, people of the south, and the Antavaratra, people of the north. A warlord named Ramanano gathered 20 clans of Antatsimo into an alliance called Tsikoa, the Invincible. They treated the northerners brutally, enslaving, burning villages and crops, and even desecrating their tombs, an unholy act among the ancestor-worshipping Malagasy. The Antavaratra turned to the Zanamalata, the mulatto descendants of pirates, who were now regarded as a sort of separate tribe, similar to the Arab-descended Antaloatra. The leader of the Zanamalata was a mysterious hero named Ratsimilao. His origins are obscure. He was said to be the offspring of Tamo, Tom, an English pirate. Some believe him to have been Thomas II. Others speculate on Mulatto Tom. Others believe he was Thomas White, a possibly fictional pirate appearing in A General History. After a short stay in England, Ratsimilao returned to Madagascar, rallied his desperate people into the Bestimisaraka, the many inseparable, armed them with muskets, and marched on the southern enemy. The war would continue for many years. The French took an interest in this story in the mid-18th century, when they renewed their ambition to colonize the island. In the late 18th century, Malata descendants of pirates began manifesting their roots in other ways. On the northwestern coast, they constructed new vessels combining traditional methods and those learned from pirates. These were larger canoes up to 45 feet long and 12 feet wide, constructed from planks bolted together with wooden pegs, or soon with raffia fibers. They could carry 30 to 40 men each, but were ill-designed for the open sea. Some would lash 2 of them together for greater stability. Between 1765 and 1820, they would travel across the coast of Madagascar and into the neighboring islands, even reaching the coast of Mozambique, destroying houses and plantations, killing or enslaving the inhabitants. The largest of these expeditions consisted of between 400 and 500 canoes, carrying up to 18,000 men. They attacked African, Arab, and even Portuguese settlements. They even managed to take a Portuguese corvette of 16 guns, sent specifically to destroy them. Eventually they were defeated by the Sultan of Zanzibar in 1817. These raids would finally end with the Anglo-Malagasy Treaty, abolishing the Malagasy slave trade, which had plagued the island for so many years. Finally, Madagascar would find some semblance of peace.
Hello my friend, nice to see that you made it until the end of the video. As you might have noticed, I've recently switched onto producing more long-form content here on the tube, and owing to the increase in production cost, I am simply unable to release videos as often as I used to. You know, I research, write, record and edit all of these videos all on my lonesome. And now, there's no guarantee from YouTube that I'll necessarily receive a compensation for all of my time investment. I'm a slave to the algorithm and everything like that. So if you have the means, I would greatly appreciate if you could either make a one-time donation via PayPal, become a channel member, or even a Patreon supporter over on Patreon. You'll find all the necessary links in the video description. Additionally, Patreon supporters and channel members get early access to all of my videos. And Patreon supporters can also watch the videos without ads. And having a stable foundation of monthly supporters pretty much guarantees that I'll be able to make these videos for time indefinite. Thank you so much for watching the video. I hope you enjoyed it, and stay tuned for what's coming in the future.